So this is a conversation with Nadim El Kak. He is a researcher at the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies with a background in sociology and political science. I wanted to have Nadim on after reading his Twitter thread on the second wave of the Lebanon protests. Is Lebanon undergoing a second wave of protests, and how do they differ from the October 2019 ones? As usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at Fire These Times and on Instagram at The Fire These Times. And if you want to support, you can do so with only $1 a month on Patreon or on buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Thank you for your time.
So, my name is Nadim El Kak. I'm a researcher at the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, and I'm also a graduate fellow studying at the American University of Beirut and a master's in sociology. I'm initially trained in political science and Middle Eastern studies at Amherst College in Massachusetts, and I'm now based in Beirut. I've been here for almost a year.
Just a couple of weeks ago, more or less, I think, I had a conversation with Timur Al-Azhari, the journalist, a Lebanese journalist for Al Jazeera, and it was a sort of assessment of this kind of half a year since the start of the uprisings. And one of the things that he said, which really struck me, was, basically, this government hasn't really had its big test yet, something that is really visible. And well, in the past few days, we've been seeing that actually happening. We actually lost a protester who was murdered by security forces. He died of his wounds overnight, and it really does seem that that the situation is what it is. In many ways, all of us, I think, were expecting it. It's been very predictable that that people are going to get out of their homes at some point because of the economic situation. Are we actually seeing a second wave of protests in Lebanon? And if yes, what are some ways these will be similar to the October or post-October ones? And what are some ways that you feel it might be different?
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of issues that are really relevant right now. Obviously, we've seen an upsurge in protests this past week. Not, and the center of it hasn't been Beirut. It's been the two other largest cities in Lebanon, Tripoli in the north and Saida in the south. There's the second wave. I think a lot of people were anticipating it and were waiting for it. Obviously, with the global pandemic and the lockdown, there's been a sense of like a hiatus, if we may call it that. And now things are definitely resurging in a lot of different ways. A lot of these ways are very similar to what we saw in October, but there's also a lot of distinguishing factors. So I would say that the conditions or like the symptoms that initially brought people to the streets are very similar, but the conditions are worsening. So the devaluation of the lira has further increased since the lockdown. Unemployment rate, poverty, inflation, all of those socioeconomic factors have worsened. But we're seeing a shift also in revolutionary strategies. If we remember the end of the first wave of the uprising, there was a clear sense of that shift already starting to emerge. So a lot of more violent means of expressing that frustration and that anger, mostly being directed at banks, and more riots happening all over the country. And now those protests have re-erupted, and they're very similar to the kind that I just described, whereas the earlier phase of the uprising, initially in October and the first couple of weeks, we saw that a lot of the squares had a rather festive nature. And on the question of the government, the Hassan Diab cabinet that you talked about, when this cabinet was formed, I think it was formed knowing very well that the second wave of the uprising was going to return. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they picked Mohammad Fahmy as Minister of Interior instead of Raya Al-Hassan. I think that was very calculated, knowing that they were going to engage in much more repressive strategies this time around.
So can you expand a bit on that last part? What is the difference between these two?
Yeah, so Mohammad Fahmy is associated closely with Jamil al-Sayed, who is a close ally of the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. He comes from a military background, so he's not. And in the past speeches that he's given, it's been very clear that he's willing to take the strongman approach, to not back down to protesters. And whereas Rael Hassan, while her stint as Minister of Interior and the way she managed to deal with the first wave of the uprising definitely had a lot of instances of violence and repression, you felt like her conscience was somewhat weighing on her and that she wasn't very comfortable playing that role. And so I think the establishment realized that they needed someone who was more willing to engage in such repressive strategies and not like question those decisions twice before engaging in them. And it's also Muhammad Fahmy is someone that probably the pro-Syrian regime parties feel more comfortable with than Raya Al-Hassan, who was very like part of the Future movement and a very close to Saad al-Hariri.
And so one of the, so you mentioned it a bit, but the revolutionary tactics, the tactics used by protesters are definitely shifting. Sometimes you sometimes feel, well, it's we've had what 2 or 3 days of explicit targeting of not public institutions, like government institutions and especially banks. We've seen this a lot in Tripoli, obviously, especially. That's where the protester who was killed, if I'm not mistaken. What are can you talk a bit about the reaction? So you did touch a bit about it on the sorry now about the fact that well this new guy might be actually more violent now. How have we been seeing the government in general, or if you wanna be a bit more general, the ruling classes in general in Lebanon right now? What are some? Well, you've listed five counter-revolutionary mechanisms. I'll just let you list them and expand on them a bit if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure, sure. So we touched a little bit on one of them, which was repression. Those and repression can take on different forms, right? So you can repress protesters physically, like we saw the past couple of days. There can also be repression of the press and other forms of repression and state violence that manifest in different ways. But also there are other things that we can think about, like the co-optation that some parties were very much engaged in the first stage of the uprising. Um, the Lebanese forces, the Kataib, and the Progressive Socialist Party, who belong to the bloc that's opposed to the Hezbollah and the Amal movement camp, have been very vocal in expressing their support to the uprising and trying to co-opt it in a sense that benefits their political interests. Uh, and and in part, this co-optation is a form of sectarianization, right? Because when you start viewing protesters or framing those movements as pitting the March 14 camp, the more pro-Western camp, with the March 8 camp, although that binary is is questionable at times, it's relevant to think about it like that because it's still very much in people's psyches. And when you start thinking about it that way, it starts stripping protesters of their agency, because it start like every time someone has to mobilize, they have to justify that they're not affiliated to the political class, that they're not being asked to join the streets by a specific sectarian leader. And we see that a lot, especially in Tripoli. People are constantly having to prove that they are protesting because of the living conditions that they're facing, because they're fighting for their survival, and that they're not actually backers of the Future movement and Saad al-Hariri's bid to return to the political arena as prime minister. There's this constant need to validate, and for a lot of people, this rhetoric and this discourse resonates, and it's effective in making them question the motives behind those actions taking place. So that's another tool that they've deployed throughout, and that was more effective before October 2019. If we think of the 2015 garbage crisis movement, co-optation as a mechanism was a lot more effective than when it was deployed this time around. That's a little bit of it. And then there's, of course, fear mongering. There's blaming the protesters for the worsening economic condition, for the health crises. So all of these things to remove the burden from the political and business establishment and put that burden on the shoulders of protesters who are already carrying really the weight of the world on their shoulders.
It's really important that you mention how fear mongering and essentially scapegoating whole groups of people in Lebanon, how that actually worked in 2015. And it's important for us to recognize this because one of the things that we felt, especially towards the end of, I mean, during the protests in starting October 2019, is that this kind of technique hasn't. It's not that it doesn't work at all anymore, but like it's been a bit less efficient as it used to be before. Now there's more of this explicit, like on the first night, I think a few days ago, second night, there was this video that I shared on Twitter as well of people, protesters in the Ba'a saying like, we're separating Beirut from the Ba'a in the name of Tripoli, like in solidarity with protesters in Tripoli, and it's that kind of cross-regional, especially, which often in Lebanon gets translated into a cross-sectarian or even anti-sectarian politics, obviously due to how Lebanon is actually structured, how the regions are cut off from one another sometimes, well, most of the time. It's something that we hope. Like, I mean, so I'll put it in a different way. Our fear, and you can expand on this or confirm it, or even disagree. That would be obviously fine. My fear, I'll speak for myself. From early on, like from October, really, was the sectarianization that this can really be used in a very very explicit way because the ruling parties, whoever at the time, we did not know who will leave first or whatever, and then you have the Uwed that left and whatever, that's a different story. um, that this would be the thing that would be very difficult for protesters who are anti-sectarian to really counteract because there's this uh, how do you call this? Like there are structures in place essentially. Like sectarianism in Lebanon, sometimes I like to compare it with capitalism, and indeed they work together, obviously, because it's both invisible and omnipresent at the same time. It doesn't necessarily have to show itself all the time. That doesn't have to be ex-Shia yelling at ex-Sunni or vice versa, or a Christian, like whatever. It doesn't have to be this explicit all the time. And in fact, one of the good signs I think that it may not get to that point, and hopefully let's hope that it doesn't, is that whenever this did happen, like that video of the Free Patriotic Movement guy, I forgot where it was. Um the Free Patriotic Movement guy basically insulting this random protester from Tripoli and using very explicitly sectarian languages against him, and how there was a backlash against that the very next day. So this is why for me personally, like scapegoating, fear mongering, and sectarization, like these things really work in the same way. And as you mentioned, maybe if we can spend a bit of time talking about why it works in some ways, even as we said now, maybe to a more limited extent than it used to before. But why does it work so much when governments? Well, sorry. Why? I'll rephrase it in a different way. Why is Tripoli the area, the city that is most focused on by these kinds of sectarian forces in Lebanon?
Yeah, well, yeah, Tripoli in a lot of ways captures a lot of this precarity that has been driving a lot of Lebanese all over the country to protest. It's a country, it's a city that has probably the highest share of wealth inequality in the country. It's known for having a lot of millionaires, and whereas a large majority of that wealth doesn't actually manifest in the living conditions of the people of Tripoli. There's also the Islamist element, the more radical, violent groups there that are involved. So there's always, and it's a very contentious city because it's not clearly the stronghold of any particular group, right? Like Hariri controlled maybe a big won in elections a lot there, but then we've seen his stronghold there being very much undermined. So these attempts at sectarianization should also be thought about within the symbolic capital that and the capital that the intangible capital that different sectarian groups try to cultivate. And by doing that, they try to exploit those precarious living conditions. Because, like you said, we can't think of sectarian identity without thinking about socioeconomic identity. And these are two things that are often conflated. People may claim that, oh, once people get poorer, they will revert back to their sectarian cultures or sectarian parties. And we need to be very careful in the type of terminology that we use here, because we just said that it was poverty that was driving people towards sectarian parties. So it's not an ingrained sectarian identity that's doing that. It's very much, how do we guarantee that we are able to feed our kids the next day, or able to get medicine for our parents, or pay for rent at the end of the month. So these two things, class and sect, are often conflated in very harmful and dangerous ways that reproduce a lot of Orientalist and regressive narratives about the country. And when you do this over and over again, it gets absorbed, and it ends up manifesting at the social level as well. So while it may come from the top, it might be systemic in nature, it ends up like spreading even throughout society, and then you have other bottom-up mechanisms that emerge and that make those discourses even more effective.
Yeah, yeah. And indeed, we've been seeing this, well, online especially. We see a lot of these terminologies being used against protesters in Tripoli, calling them stuff like Islamists and, the ISIS supporters and whatever, which really betrays this very blatant attempt to sectarianize um, the situation. And, going back to this being a fear of mine in the beginning. So let me kind of segue this into a bit. I'll be referring a bit to the Twitter thread that you posted, and I will link that in the description. You identified clientelism, or wasta, as we call it in Lebanon, and you identified it very correctly as one of the ways the ruling class says in Lebanon will try to weaken the revolution. Um, I'll just let you talk a bit about this. Like, what is, so for those who don't even know, how does clientelism function in Lebanon, and what are some of the ways that you think the ruling classes might actually, well, utilize it essentially?
Yeah. So if we want to talk about clientelism, we also have to talk about the role of the state. And there's been, while capitalism has been at the core of the Lebanese state since its independence, if we look specifically at the post-war period, attempts at neoliberalization have been very much stronger. In the 1990s, the labor union movement used to be a strong vehicle for which class-based organizing would take place. But by the end of the 1990s, this movement was co-opted and repressed. And progressively, you saw that there was no social safety net that was developing, although wealth was accumulating. And instead, because you didn't have a state that was providing services along universal lines, you had clientelistic networks filling that gap. And those clientelistic networks operate largely along sectarian lines. Now, certain parties may distribute services to members outside of the sect they claim to represent, and that depends on the strategy of each party. There's a lot of literature on that topic, but generally speaking, clientelism is perceived as being distributed along sectarian lines, and clientelism can take on different forms. So it can be in the form of accessing a job, or being able, or someone paying for education or healthcare, or even providing legal services, or having authorization or permits to open a shop in a certain area. So all of these different types of wasta, as we may call them, or like privileges, that not privileges, but rather services that are being provided, really can range and take on so many different forms. And this dependency, this material dependency that is created, is very much deployed during electoral seasons. So that's when we see that sectarian parties try to exploit that, and they try to make sure that they maintain their basis, but through those services. So that really makes you question, what type of supporters do these parties have? Are these supporters that believe in the politics or the policies or the vision that these parties have outlined, or are they just doing that out of desperation? Um, and I think a lot of it ends up, as the country's economic conditions have worsened, it's become more and more clear that the main tool that these parties hold in order to remain in power is through clientelism. And that's becoming clearer and clearer. So now that the economic crisis hit and the health crisis hit and conditions are worsening, a lot of fears are emerging, because people are struggling so much that there are concerns about citizens having no other alternative but to turn to political parties um, to receive the basic necessities they need to go on with their lives.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I feel like this, like, thank you for that. You've painted a decent picture of like where we are essentially now. Can you talk a bit about some of these things that you've been reflecting on how, for example, we need to be better organized? And here I'm quoting you, like neighborhood councils and alternative unions are key. We've been seeing some of those alternative unions, they're still relatively small. Hopefully, they'll be growing in the months to come, especially as the need for them becomes much more apparent. Can you talk a bit about, well, something like what would neighborhood councils look like, for example? And you can pretty much just imagine it on the spot. That's fine. We're not expecting, I think, detailed plans or anything like this. These are very difficult things to think about in the first place. So I really appreciate anything you can, well, think about with me in a sense.
Yeah, I think as you said though, we started to feel like those seeds were starting to emerge since October 17 when the uprising began. And I think because a lot of the organizing that was taking place was very organic. It was people who met in the squares or in their neighborhoods who joined WhatsApp groups together, who would go to the streets together, block roads together, and then progressively the sense of solidarity and community was very much at the forefront of organizing efforts. Then there were more organized initiatives that, like you mentioned, those alternative unions from different professions that started organizing. And then you had other emerging political groups that had already been um in the political arena, but didn't necessarily have the same amount of visibility that they were able to cultivate during the uprising. So in terms going back to the neighborhood council aspect of it, um, I think this is really essential because at the end, when we know that the political establishment is not going to meet the demands of the protesters outright, and that it's going to take a long while to be able to exert that pressure needed to overthrow a political class like that, that's so attached to power and that has a lot to lose by relinquishing it. So one way to make sure that this movement is able to hold on and withstand the blows that it's constantly facing from the range of counter-revolutionary mechanisms that we discussed is cultivating the sense of community and the sense of solidarity. And the best and most effective way of doing that is with the people around you in your neighborhood, in your vicinity, or in your profession. Now, there's the main population in the streets are youth, and a majority of youth are unemployed. So that also forces the question of how do you organize all of those unemployed? Should there be something that a type of union that brings those people together? So any kind of identities and other forms of identities that move beyond sectarian identity towards other forms of self-identification that matter a lot more to people and that are a lot more significant in shaping their daily realities. Those things require a lot of effort and a lot of investment. And building those foundations has to start somewhere. And we're starting to see that, but it needs to be scaled up. And the importance of doing that needs to be recognized and appreciated more. Otherwise, cracks will be easier to cracks will begin emerging within the protesters' ranks, I believe.
Yeah, I agree. Here I would reference, and I'll remember to put this on the blog post associated with the episode as well. But one of my formative experiences, in a sense of, well, politically speaking, was reading Omar Aziz, the Syrian anarchists' pamphlet and essays, essentially on the need to create local councils and local councils in Syria. And in Syria, for me, the obviously the situation is very different. It's very, very difficult to compare two different countries, even though they're neighbors. We don't have one Bashar al-Assad. We don't have that kind of structure. There's no one ism. I mean, we can argue that there is sectarianism, but as you mentioned as well, it's more complicated than that in the day-to-day stuff. What I'm wondering, and here I'm just thinking out loud, really. Do you have a sense that um, we know, and I mean, I'm here also referring to one of the tweets, that a total victory is really really unlikely. Like, it's very difficult in the context of Lebanon. Well, I feel anyway that we will be able to, overthrow the system and, have an alternative to secularism and even beyond that. Yeah, I think it's very unlikely, especially in the conditions that we're finding ourselves in. But neighborhood councils, the alternative unions, as you mentioned yourself, these could be ways of creating progressive concessions. Do you feel that the more we organize on that front, the more it's organized anyway on that front, the more the need for progressive concessions will be made apparent? By which I mean, one of the things that I always worry about, and here I'm saying this as someone who, like, I was basically worrying about this while being on the streets as well, in Beirut especially. Um, there's always a sense like we feel whenever, especially when we're on the streets and enough momentum has passed, we feel like we can kind of push things a bit further. And then we get sort of the reality check, if you want, if you want to use those terms, that, well, no, you can't push that far. You have to actually back up a bit. This I mean, this is normal. This is part of this is part of any revolution, any kind of protest movement, especially one that is as grassroots as the one that we're seeing right now in Lebanon. But you mentioned yourself that the only Arab revolutions, or Arab majority revolutions, we should say, that were relatively successful were the one in Sudan and the one in Tunisia. And this is important because it's not that, putting aside the Libyan story and the Syrian story, because the complications there, and the Yemeni for that matter, because the complications there are of a different scale, in my opinion. But what distinguishes the situation in Sudan and Tunisia, for example, and here you can kind of use brush strokes if you don't want to get into the details of individual countries. What differentiates them, if you want, from what is lacking in Lebanon, and how can we learn from them in a sense?
Yeah, I think the role of neighborhood councils and labor unions in those contexts, they had a much longer history of being present in those societies. Neighborhood councils in Sudan had been around for a while. The labor unions, while they were a part of, like, they were formal labor unions, so affiliated to the state, there were a lot of different currents within them, some that were more opposed to the Tunisian regime. And then once the uprising started, they began playing a more substantial role in organizing the ranks and pressuring the state into the regime into meeting protesters' demands. I think that this backbone, this historical backbone, is somewhat missing. And it's not only important in order to organize efforts, it's also about the collective psyches. Because when you lack those structures, those class-based structures for so long, the sense of class solidarity needs to be cultivated and needs to re-emerge from scratch somewhat. There's in the case of Lebanon, people tend to think that society is primarily organized around sects, not recognizing that it's really the clearer cleavage in society is the wealth cleavage, the one that exists in terms of um, uh, socioeconomic identities. So the main difference here is that we're starting behind. We're having to rebuild something that was taken away from us. And without having those organizational structures in place, you feel like there's a huge generational gap. Where if you're trying to organize along class identity, you have those old leftist men who still who very much believe in the class struggle, but exhibit a lot of patriarchal tendencies sometimes. And then you have the younger, inexperienced youth who maybe knows about the importance of organizing along those lines, but is still doesn't know on a day-to-day basis how you go about in building such a movement and in getting people to join the ranks of whatever initiative you're coming up with. So what ends up happening is that a lot of times those emerging movements struggle in being very much middle class oriented, or being at least started by people who are more middle class. So once you start, if that is your foundation, it's very hard to avoid the elitist label and to actually be able to uh, become a more inclusive movement. And that's what we've seen with those new, whether it's the labor unions or the emerging political groups. These have been the main populations and the main members of these groups. So it's about really asking ourselves, how can we scale that up and be a more inclusive kind of movement that doesn't necessarily stand on, oh, these people reaching out to different communities and asking them to join, but rather encouraging different communities and different neighborhoods and different regions to take on this task by themselves. And then you can think about a more national, centralized kind of representation for the uprising. But it needs to start at the local level and at the grassroots level. And it can't be led from a centralized new political party that claims to speak in the names of people, like we've seen some try to do. Otherwise, those new initiatives are going to keep falling into the same issues where they're stuck and not able to attract the masses necessary to wage an effective and credible battle against the establishment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the way I would I could add to this is it's either we learn how to organize right now, or we'll have to be forced to learn how to organize even faster. As in, either we do it now, or we'll have to do it in 6 months, or in a year, or in 2 years, or in 3 years, or whatever. And by then, things will be even more difficult than they are now, given the ongoing situation that we're in. And it doesn't seem, objectively anyway, to expect it to just calm down on its own. If anything, we have every reason to believe that things can worsen, and that things will worsen unless we find ways to resist, essentially, through some of the mechanisms that you yourselves mentioned. Nadim, you've been very, very generous with your time. Is there, I usually tend to forget to ask something, or it will come later. Is there anything that, that you feel like we could have expanded upon a bit, but like we didn't?
I think we touched on a lot of issues. I think we're good for now. If there's anything else that's worth another podcast episode, I'd be more than happy to join again.
That'd be amazing to be like the first of many updates.
Yeah, hope so.
Thank you for your time, Nadim.
Thank you, Joey, and good luck dealing with the quarantine and the accumulation of crises that we're dealing with.
Well, same to you. Thanks a lot.